Okay. Test this. Test this. Alright, sounds like it's working. That's good. Alright, so we need to finish up talking about how we bring new products and services to market today. And we were talking last time about no significant point of difference, and the thing I asked you about was the iPhone. Is there a significant difference between the new iPhone and the iPhone that I have? And I'm not sure that there is. There are, at least one feature that seems to be different, which is a button that will allow you to instantly open the camera, or you can select whatever it is that you want that button to do, whatever app it is that you use the most frequently. Is that really that big of a deal? What does that actually save you in terms of time? Not much, right? Is there really a significant point of difference? Why is it that Apple has continued to be able to do that, even though there isn't a significant point of difference? Well, they've kind of convinced us that we need to have the newest, latest, and greatest thing. And also, at some point in time, I guess one of the things that makes it easy is that phones just sort of, become old and clunky, and the batteries don't work very well. And it's just easier to get a new phone and have the newest model rather than trying to update the phone that you have by putting in new batteries and taking it to the repair shop and things like that. But at some point, I'm not sure that strategy of cannibalization is going to work if they don't really add some kind of value. The second reason that you might have a failure is you might have an attractive product, you might have a market that's feasible, but no economic access to buyers. This happens a lot with consumer packaged goods, and we have examples of this in Oklahoma where people have gotten lucky. So I remember the first time when I was getting my PhD in New Mexico, in Las Cruces, New Mexico. They have great Mexican food in Las Cruces, although it's not. I'm from Santa Fe, and northern New Mexico is even different than southern New Mexico, but at least they use Hatch green chili, which is actually produced in southern New Mexico, not very far from Las Cruces. And in fact, the green chilies that come from New Mexico were developed at New Mexico State, and all of the stats courses that I took at New Mexico State involved chili pod cultivar examples, because the stats department was in the College of Agriculture at New Mexico State. It's an ag college, which makes sense. And so a lot of their consulting in the stats department was with the agriculture department. And what is it that New Mexico produces a lot of? Well, they produce a lot of chili peppers, right? And Hatch is where most of those chilies are produced. And so there were all of these examples about chili pod cultivar number 457 or whatever it was. That was the dominant variety of green chili that New Mexico State had developed, that's used in most of the cuisine of New Mexico. And I would ask the stats professors if they could give us like a business example of how we would use these various techniques in business. And they were like, yeah, come up with your own example, right? So the reason I tell you this is that there's lots of great Mexican food in New Mexico. I was born and raised in Santa Fe. I appreciate that, but I've lived in Oklahoma long enough. What is very indicative of Oklahoma cuisine, not so indicative of New Mexico cuisine? Barbecue. The South is famous for barbecue, right? I mean, I think it's one of the things that if you said, what is a stereotypical Oklahoma or Southern dish, the first thing that would probably come to mind is chicken fried steak. We have a lot of chicken fried steak here. The next thing that would come to mind is barbecue. I mean, that's one of the things that we do a lot of. And there's a company in Oklahoma that produces what I think is one of the best barbecue sauces and rubs around, and it's called Head Country. And I will never forget the first time I saw Head Country in the Walmart in southern New Mexico. There's like no barbecue restaurants in Las Cruces, New Mexico. There's lots of Mexican food restaurants, no barbecue restaurants that I can recall. And if they were, they were probably like god awful. And so literally I almost broke down and cried when I saw that they were carrying Head Country in the Walmart in southern New Mexico. Well, the way Head Country got into Walmart is At one point in time, the managers of Walmart stores actually had some discretion to source local products. That is no longer the case. And so Head Country became enormously popular. How did they develop? They developed this barbecue sauce and rub, and their manufacturing process plant is here in Oklahoma. It's in Ponca City, and I actually know the founder's son. He's a sort of an acquaintance of mine, and they actually managed to get into Walmart by showing the local stores in Oklahoma that they were popular enough among Oklahoma to take a risk and put them on the shelves in Oklahoma. That is no longer the case. They no longer have any discretion to do that, but they were very successful and very lucky in that they managed to get into Walmart. And then once it started to show popularity in places like Oklahoma and Texas, they extended the product line that they would carry in terms of Head Country to other stores in Walmart. That's an example of you have a great product. It's one that people want, but if you can't get into Walmart, your chances of really scaling your consumer packaged goods are very low because Walmart is the largest retailer, or was the largest retailer in the world. They are the largest employer, also private employer in the world to this day, I believe. So if you can't get into Walmart, so here's another example, right? So Head Country was around long enough that they were lucky and they got into Walmarts in Oklahoma when store managers still had a lot of discretion to source some local goods. Now, if you want to sell to Walmart, you have to go to Bentonville. That's the way it works, as I understand it. You have to go to Bentonville unless they've changed recently. That's the thing. Well, that's not necessarily easy to do for lots of small manufacturers of consumer packaged goods like Head Country. We had another company that is sort of successful here, regionally successful, called Maria Reyes, which is a woman who she and her husband moved to California. They really like, and Mexican food is different in every single state, by the way. Particularly, like, there's a difference between New Mexico Mexican and Arizona Mexican, and the difference between Arizona Mexican and California Mexican. They moved from Enid, Oklahoma to Southern California for her husband's job, and they really liked the Mexican food in Southern California. They moved back to Oklahoma when their family started to get older and they were retiring, and they couldn't find Mexican food that was similar to the Mexican food in California. So her husband said, you know, I think you ought to start a Mexican restaurant. She said, I don't think I want to do that. She's actually a graduate of UCO, the woman who started this company. She said, I don't want to do that. We don't know anything about the restaurant business. It's hard. Restaurants go broke very quickly, right? It's a business that's very easy to go broke in. And she said, I don't think I want to do that. But he kept on and kept on. He kept saying, you know, we're not finding the Mexican food that we like here in Enid. So let's start a Mexican restaurant. So they started this Mexican restaurant, and it was pretty successful in Enid. And people started asking for their salsas, if they would sell the salsa. And so they got this idea that, well, maybe they could start selling the salsa, right? And they were pretty successful at selling the salsa. And they were pretty lucky in that there's a major food manufacturer in Enid called Pierre Foods, which was locally owned at the time. And they were willing to help them take this product to market. But by the time they brought their product to market, they're a younger company than, I believe, Head Country. It was harder to get into Walmart. The local management couldn't just decide that they were going to take a risk and sell stuff. So she had to go around, and she tells the story about how she went to all of these independent grocers and would put out displays and do taste tests and things like that to get her product on the shelves of these local IGAs and smaller grocery stores in order to try and scale their product. So many consumer packaged goods don't have access because they can't afford the grocery slotting fees to get their product on the shelf. If you want to get your product on the shelf in Walmart, you're going to pay slotting fees. So that's one of the reasons why you can have a great product, you can have a market. There's a big market for things like barbecue and salsa and those kinds of specialty foods, right? but it can be very difficult to get those in front of the consumer without having an enormous amount of financial backing to be able to pay those slotting fees. An incomplete protocol can lead to problems with your ability to bring something to market. And I think I sort of mentioned this last time. I had a colleague and we'd started a business and we did product testing for various companies. And one of the products that we tested, the CEO just decided he wanted something else. And we were sitting there saying, that wasn't tested. That's not what we went out and tried. And why would you think that that would be successful? And his response was, well, because I like that. Well, you're not the demographic of the consumer that goes to the business that he was CEO of. So lack of satisfaction of critical factors. So if you don't have a complete way of satisfying the needs of the consumer, that can be, if it's, if it doesn't have the actual fulfillment of all of the needs, those critical factors can be an issue in why your product or service will fail. Some of these you can control, right? And some of them are really, really difficult to control. So having a complete protocol is one of those factors that you can absolutely control. Timing is one of those factors that you can't control. If you launched a company right before COVID closed everything down in 2019, you might have experienced a failure in your business, right? I mean, the economy basically, as a result of, and that's something that you have absolutely no control. World pandemic is not something that you can plan for or control. And if that happens, bad timing, it just, that's one of those factors that's very, very difficult to foresee, things like the COVID-19 pandemic. If we had, for example, hyperinflation and the interest rates went through the roof, and they're pretty high right now. They're not as high as they have been in the 1970s and early 1980s, for example. Interest rates were at 15%. And so that's a huge amount of money to have to be able to come up with to service debt if you are financing your company. And so those kinds of timing issues can lead to a reason for a market failure. Poor quality. Even large companies, and the thing I used here, and you all don't even remember this, Microsoft has released various versions of its product over the years, right? As it has progressed from the original sort of Windows to the current, versions of Microsoft. Vista was one of those products that, like, they did a lot to advertise it and promote it, and it was a really, really poor product, and customers just sort of revolted, and they just kept the old version until Microsoft released a better version. Microsoft is sort of famous for doing that because they have such a huge market share of the operating systems. Almost every non-Mac platform or book operates on Microsoft, right? So, but people just didn't migrate to the newest version when they came up with Vista. A lack of market attractiveness, having a market that's too small and not being able to sell in those kinds of specialty markets because the price point is just going to be too high. And then poor execution of the marketing mix, not combining. You can have a great product, right? And you can have an attractive market if you don't effectively communicate that through your integrated marketing communication, or you fail to be able to launch it through the marketing channels to get it to customers in the marketing mix, that's going to lead to failure. So you can have a great product, you can have an attractive market size, and if you can't successfully navigate the marketing channel that you need to get it through, then you can have failure. Now, in some respects, this is becoming, when we talk about channels later on in the semester, this has become somewhat easier in the age of the internet because people can sell things in the internet because we've been able to disaggregate or disintermediate in some respects a lot of goods and sell directly to the consumer. So, what are the steps to ensure success? There are 7 steps, and StageGate has a formal evaluation process for each stage to determine whether or not you should proceed to the next stage in the development of your new product or service, or whether or not you can correct and fix the problems that you have, or if you should, in what I call cut bait and run. So this is a term from fishing. When you snag your line, at some point you try and get your line and your lure out, right? And at some point you just have to cut it and run. So the first step is to define the role that the product will fulfill in the overall corporate objective. And you need to combine the SWOT, which is strengths, weaknesses, and then opportunities and threats. So the 2 internal, 2 external, and then engage in the environmental scan of the market. Is the market going to be big enough? Is it attractive enough? Do you have a significant point of difference, right? So combining these things, again, one of the things that we talk about when we teach classes that is different than the real world is we talk about these topics as though they are sort of distinct and unique, isolated aspects, and they're not. You have to think about how this overall integrates, how these different concepts come into play and work together in order to be successful, which is one of the things that makes marketing really unique, is that because it is the only fully integrated function of the firm, and I think I told you all this, that's the one thing, if you take nothing else from this class, is that marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm. All of the other aspects, again, and I'll say this again because redundancy is good, you can generally do without knowing a great deal about them. But if you don't know something about marketing, you're going to fail, right? You don't have to know about double entry accounting and the GAAP to be a successful business. There are lots of, my mother was horrible with math. She ran lots of successful businesses, right? She could figure out, and particularly once her bank statement went online, she could look at whether or not she had enough money in the account to, buy products or services or things like that. Didn't know anything about double entry bookkeeping. She had an accountant that would ultimately do that. You don't necessarily have to know anything about management if you're only working for yourself and not relying on anybody else, right? But you have to know something about marketing. And so combining these things is really, really important, and understanding how you go about doing that. Step 2, develop your ideas. Where do you get these? Well, some companies that are large enough rely on their employees. 3M, for example, allows their employees to spend a certain percentage of their time that they are being compensated for working on projects that are not necessarily officially sanctioned products of the company. So they can use resources and time to actually work on things that are of interest to them. Now, what happens if they develop something that is marketable and they've used company resources and time? Well, who owns it? 3M owns it. They own the product, right? And so the example that I have of this is Post-its. 3M is known for adhesives. That's one of the things that they do, is they manufacture adhesives for a lot of different applications. 3M, I believe, is the one who came up with the light cure. How many of you had braces when you were a teenager? Almost everybody in the United States. That's a thing that we do here. The British don't seem to do it, which is why they have crooked teeth. But in the United States, we're obsessed with aesthetics. And so, and it's not just, I mean, having straight teeth is not just aesthetically pleasing, it's also, in many respects, it preserves your teeth for longer. And so we do that. So when I had braces many, many, many years ago, it took a long time to actually do a full mouth of braces. You all remember this if you had braces. They take a bracket and they attach it, they adhere it to the tooth. And that used to take, when I got my braces, a long time. The orthodontist would have to sit there, or his assistant, they would place the bracket on the tooth and they would have to hold it for actually several minutes before the cement would cure and adhere to the tooth so that they could then fit the wire through the brackets, right? So that they could then thread the wire through the brackets. 3M came up with a really fast way of adhering that so that you could do a mouthful of brackets. And how many of you had this? It was called Light Cure, where what they did is they put the adhesive on the tooth, they put the bracket, and then they shine ultraviolet light on it, and it cures or adheres to the tooth almost instantly. It saves an enormous amount of time. If you're talking about a mouthful of teeth, both top and bottom, and you're having to sit there for 3 to 4 minutes per tooth and hold the bracket in place, that takes quite a bit of time. And it's also tedious, and it's also maybe difficult to do because you have to have kind of a steady hand to apply these brackets. Well, if you could instantly cure it, that's a big advancement, right? It takes far less time. It means that orthodontists can get, and how do you make money if you're an orthodontist? By putting more brackets on teeth faster, right? So you've got happier customers, you've got happier orthodontists. They can now see more customers by cutting the time just like down to seconds as opposed to minutes per tooth. So 3M is known for adhesives. They came up, I believe, with Light Cure. And one of the things that they were working on, a chemist at 3M was working on adhesives, and they came up with an adhesive that wasn't terribly adhesive. Light Cure is obviously an adhesive that is really, really adhesive. You all remember when you got your brackets taken off, right? They have to actually work at getting that bracket off because it's got to stay on under an enormous amount of tension when they put the wire on to move the teeth, right? So it's a really tough adhesive that sticks really, really well. Well, they came up with this adhesive that didn't stick very well. But they noticed that one of the things that you could do with this adhesive is if you stuck 2 pieces of paper together, you could remove the paper from each other and it wouldn't tear. The 2 pieces of paper wouldn't tear. So they came up with Post-its, right? So the employees actually developed, or an employee actually developed this product. That's a source of information and ideas for your company, right? Customers and suppliers, using the sales force to listen to customers and what it is that they want and need to develop products and services that are going to be beneficial to them. And then, of course, there are formal research and development labs. Things like drugs are brought to market through formal research and development planning and labs. So you have an illness out there and you need something to solve it, and they use formal labs. Now, it turns out that a lot of times in these research and development labs, things that you develop for one thing may work for something else. One of the products that they have developed to deal with prostate problems for men is a drug called finasteride. And they noticed that when they were giving this drug to men that had enlarged prostates, they grew hair. And so they then started selling this product, finasteride, as a drug that would grow hair. And so it was manufactured in the research and development lab and brought to market for prostate problems and ended up being something else. Another example of that is people who had glaucoma, they started noticing that their eyelashes were growing really, really long. So they developed this product, an eye drop for glaucoma to deal with glaucoma, or I think that's right. I think it's glaucoma. They developed this eye drop to help mitigate the effects of glaucoma, and they started noticing that people who were taking it, their eyelashes grew. So they then developed this product, not just for people with glaucoma. It's called Latisse, and you put it on, and it grows eyelashes, right? So your research and development labs are sources, obviously, for idea generation. Then screening and evaluation of the idea. Is it technically feasible? The company that I worked for internally was famous for doing this. The CEO was constantly pushing us to tell school districts one of the ways that you sold learning management systems to these school districts was by coming up with titles that they needed in order to satisfy their standardized tests that they were facing, right? And so I remember we were looking at this RFP and we were trying to figure out a way that we could manufacture our product to be the sole source, and we didn't have necessarily the titles in development that the school district was looking for. And I went to the CEO and I said, Jeff, like, you put down that we have these titles and we don't even have them in development. And his response to me was, live on the edge. We'll if we get awarded the contract, we'll develop it. And I'm like, okay, is that actually feasible? Can we actually develop? It's not like writing content is not something that you can just do until recently with artificial intelligence quickly. In the mid 2000s, you still had to develop this content on your own, and it took time. Like, you had to find authors that were going to go out and develop it and come up with the layouts and stuff like that. So is it technically feasible? Amazingly, he lived on the edge a lot, and we managed to pull it off almost every single time without having a failure. But it was always it made me very nervous, made me sweat that he was willing to do that. And then externally testing and evaluating the ideas on the actual consumers that are going to use the product. Develop business analysis of the product or service. You have to have detailed financial projections. What is it that the market is, how much is it going to cost you to bring this product to market? And then what will the market bear in terms of price? And assessing that market. You can have, again, something that people want and it's attractive, but if it's beyond the price point that they can afford, do you actually have a feasible market? Step 5, developing the actual product, a prototype, to ensure that you can efficiently produce the product or service. And then engaging in lab testing. Now, some of this you can't do, particularly with things like services in many respects. It can be really difficult to do lab testing of services. How do you do that? One of the things that a business that has developed over the last 15 years that was largely a specialty business is Massage Envy. They have sort of standardized this. Historically, if you wanted to get a massage, it was done by independent, largely locally owned spas, or people who did it as, sort of independent contractors who would go to your location and set up a massage table. Massage Envy has standardized this, and they've developed a whole chain of spas. And one of the things that makes them successful is that they have managed to standardize the service. Now, that can be really, really hard to do and really, really hard to test. Why? Because massage in many instances is highly individualistic, right? So they have standardized a lot of it, but massage is one of those things that if you've ever had them, people like, various pressures applied, and that can be things that are very difficult to test. Obviously, you can't develop sort of a lab. They've managed to actually standardize some of this. It's also very difficult to consumer test because, again, this is one of those services that is highly. It's not like doing taxes where you can develop a software that provides a service like TurboTax for 95 to 98% of the population. Right? For most people, the standardized software and the formulas that TurboTax has work, unless you have an enormously complex business arrangement and you're a really high income producer, or you have an enormous amount of wealth and you're trying to develop methods of protecting that. TurboTax won't work for people who are billionaires, but how many billionaires are there? There's far more of us. Tax season is coming up. How many of you have filed your taxes already? Most of you have already filed your taxes, right? And you use TurboTax or Jackson Hewitt or things like that can standardize that testing, or can standardize that service, and that was easy to test. It's easy to test whether or not the software works and to get consumers to test it when TurboTax first released. Whereas massage is one of those things where it's really, really hard to engage in widespread consumer testing because it is so individualistic. But Massage Envy has actually figured out ways of doing that and standardizing procedure and protocol where they can. So market testing, exposing the actual product to prospective customers. There are different types of tests that you can do. You can do a standard market test where you attempt to sell through the normal distribution in a number of test markets. And there are a number of historically markets across the United States that are indicative of sort of the rest of the market. For years and years and years, this is no longer true. But when I was a political science major in the early 1990s, the saying was, as goes Ohio, so goes the nation. That's no longer true. But at one point in time, you looked at Ohio as a bellwether of what the political marketplace was going to do, because the demographics of the state of Ohio closely resembled sort of the nation as a whole. That's no longer true. Ohio has become much more conservative than other parts of the nation, but at the time it was sort of a bellwether of what was going to happen in the national political landscape and a good predictor of where the market was. Why has that changed? One of the things that has led to a change, I think, is that the 24-hour news cycle, when we just had CNN, that was sort of novel, but now we have all of these news channels. And so it has led to people being much more, it was historically, even up until the early 2000s, people watched ABC, NBC, CBS. And while those channels may have a certain somewhat lean or slant to their reporting, by and large, they were fairly centrist. That is no longer true in an age in which we have 24-hour news cycles and we have lots of different news outlets like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. CNBC, C-SPAN, things like that. So the standard test through normal distributions, or a controlled test where you contract with an outside testing service like Symphony IRI to conduct the test for you. You can do simulated markets where you replicate testing in limited degrees. There used to be a company that did this in Oklahoma City. They were located at Quail Springs Mall. And if you were walking through the mall, I remember doing this. They were testing ice cream one time, so I got to try all these different ice cream flavors. It was a company that was coming up with highly specialized flavors of ice cream. And so they were testing it. It was kind of fun to get to do that. Some things, again, are really hard to test. How do you test, for example, the success of a new museum? The Walton family, I think it's Alice Walton who's promoted it, has developed an art museum in Northwest Arkansas that, you know, is pretty successful now. But at the time, how do you test that? How do you test whether or not, if you wanted to replicate something like the Getty today, would be successful? If you wanted to drop that in Oklahoma City, how would you test that? One of the things that I was surprised by is actually how successful and how popular the Oklahoma City Museum of Art is, and particularly their Chihuly exhibit. If you had told me that that would have been successful at the time that they decided that that's what they were going to do, I would have said you're crazy, because the most successful and most popular museum in Oklahoma City at the time was the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, which is now called the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. They've rebranded. And so it's not just, you know, cowboys, it's also Southwest and Native American art and things like that. But that was the most popular. That's completely a different type of art. And that's what most Oklahomans wanted, was the Remingtons and the Prix West kind of stuff. And Chihuly was really, really very different. Right? I mean, it's blown glass, it's very abstract, it's not at all functional. It's you know, it's just art for art's sake. And if you told me that that would be popular, I would have thought you were crazy, but it has become enormously popular. And the Chihuly exhibit is a huge attraction that we have in the Oklahoma City area. Then finally, commercialization. Once you go through all the testing, you decide that you're actually gonna bring this to full market. You have to decide how you're going to position this. Positioning is the connection you make between your product or service in the mind of the consumer. And it's really important to get this right, to get the positioning right. The images that you get in the mind of the consumer are difficult to control, because individuals have subjective ideas, but some companies are really good at it. McDonald's, for example, was really good forever and ever and ever at being consistent, cheap, and fast. That was what McDonald's was known for: consistent, cheap, and fast, right? And when you're traveling across country, if you are driving across country with kids, you know what McDonald's is going to be. If you go to the Stables in Guthrie, which is a local barbecue place that we have in Guthrie, it could be really, really, I mean, it could be really, really good or really, really bad. One of the things that I like to do when I travel is I like to eat at local restaurants. And about 40% of the time, those are miserable failures. Now, I'm willing to experiment with that because I'm a foodie and I like that. But if you've got little kids and they're hungry and you're worried about them eating, McDonald's is going to be, you know, I mean, like almost every little kid, you can find something that they'll eat. Even one of my nephews, who's an enormously picky eater, will eat McDonald's French fries. And now he's like the craziest little kid. He doesn't like the crunchy French fries. So, and he like doesn't like the ends because they're too crunchy, so he pinches them off. And he was putting them in the little thing in the door in my car. What are you doing? You know, he's like pinching off the French fries at the ends and putting them in the door. But even he, like as picky as he is, will eat McDonald's French fries, right? You can find something at McDonald's that kids will eat. That's the image that we have in the mind of the consumer. Now, McDonald's has tried, as a result of the fact that they started losing market share to Starbucks in the morning. One of their most profitable segments is breakfast, and they were losing market share to Starbucks. So McDonald's has tried to sort of rebrand themselves, but that's really difficult. Once you've established your position in the market, it can be really difficult. This is an example of how McDonald's is coming up with new ideas and generating new products. What are they doing? If you go to McDonald's now, they have more drinks. You know, historically, McDonald's was, if you wanted coffee, there was one type of coffee, you know, black McDonald's, you know, traditionally brewed coffee that came in a cup. And if you wanted to fix it, you mixed, you know, powdered creamer with, you know, either sugar or an artificial sweetener. McDonald's now has all kinds of McCafe where they have more variety of caffeinated drinks, sort of similar to Starbucks, right? So it's really difficult to reposition yourself once you stake out a position. And then are you going to launch it regionally versus full scale? An example of this is movies. Historically, again, if you went back in time, movies in many instances, if they were indie films, would be released in selected markets rather than on a nationwide scale. Why? Because lots of, you know, French art films are not going to do real well historically in places like Oklahoma City. What does really well historically in Oklahoma City? What kinds of movies? There were national releases of movies, rom-coms, generally, action and adventure films, general. Those are sort of like everybody likes those, but French art films that are subtitled, a lot of times, for example, when I was a kid growing up, those were not released in places like Oklahoma City. If you were a movie aficionado and interested in the indie films, you had to, you know, go somewhere else. You had to go to the Sundance Film Festival or something like that to see those. Any questions about new products? All right. I'm going to end the stream. I realize that I am letting